Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating, the deeply intertwined origins of Judaism and Christianity. We're going to uncover how two entirely distinct, world-shaping religions actually emerged from one single, highly complex matrix.
So when did Christianity actually begin? It's a pretty fundamental question, right? We often assume the split happened immediately after the crucifixion of Jesus. Just a clean, instant break. But early observers in the first century, they literally wouldn't have recognized a separate religion called Christianity at all. No way. So let's just go ahead and shatter that modern assumption right now.
To grasp this history accurately, we really have to drop our modern categories and view this whole era through what scholars call the Jewish matrix. You see, the Jesus movement wasn't some external phenomenon that just dropped out of the sky. It was conceived, birthed, and completely nurtured entirely within the bounds of Second Temple Judaism. Let's quickly map out our journey. We'll be looking at inside the Jewish matrix, the early Jewish Jesus movement, the massive Gentile demographic shift, two catalytic geopolitical crises, and finally, theological boundaries and divergence.
All right, starting with Section 1, inside the Jewish matrix, and the wild diversity of Second Temple Judaism. In the first century, Second Temple Judaism absolutely wasn't a monolith. It was basically fractured into a bunch of different Judaisms. The historian Josephus outlined four major philosophies for us. You had the Sadducees, who controlled the temple, the incredibly popular Pharisees, who focused on purity, the Essenes, who were treated into strict desert isolation, and the Zealots, who were actively resisting Roman occupation. This volatile soil of competing beliefs and practices, it was the perfect environment for a new movement to spark. Moving on to Section 2, a Jewish Jesus movement, which really started as an intra-Jewish sect. Now, the Jesus movement took root not as some spontaneous new religion for Gentiles, but as a deeply Jewish messianic sect centered right in Jerusalem. Jesus was a Galilean Jew. His practices, observing the Sabbath, keeping dietary laws, were totally indistinguishable from his contemporaries. His message was thoroughly Jewish, focusing on the imminent kingdom of God. Astonishingly enough for modern ears, even after his crucifixion, his earliest followers, led initially by his brother James, continued to actively worship in the Jewish temple. And because of all that, early outside observers didn't see a new religion at all. The Acts of the Apostles describes them simply as the sect of the Nazarenes. People use the Greek term hierasis, which basically means a school of thought, treating them much like the Pharisees or Sadducees. Sure, claiming a crucified man was the resurrected Messiah was definitely unorthodox, but within this pluralistic Jewish matrix, it didn't immediately cause a schism. Which brings us to Section 3, the Gentile demographic shift, and how the boundaries started expanding. So the initial cohesion we just talked about, it began to fracture primarily because of a massive demographic shift, the inclusion of Gentiles. This was catalyzed heavily by Paul of Tarsus, who argued Gentiles could join the covenant through faith, completely without circumcision. As you can imagine, this caused a massive internal crisis. But following a pragmatic compromise at the Jerusalem Council around 48 to 50 CE, the movement's center of gravity shifted outwards to Hellenistic cities. Suddenly, you have a huge influx of believers coming in with zero historical attachment to Jewish ethno-religious identity, the Torah, or the temple. That's a really big deal. Now for Section 4. Two catalytic geopolitical crises, specifically around 70 CE and 135 CE. As you can see mapped out here, the parting of the ways was definitely not an overnight event. It was a really slow, agonizing process, spanning over a century. The demographic shifts we just looked at were ultimately accelerated into a painful divorce by two massive, violent geopolitical wedges, the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba Revolt. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in 70 CE was just an absolute existential trauma. In the aftermath, two surviving sibling movements had to radically, and I mean radically, redefine themselves. Rabbinic Judaism recentered Jewish identity squarely on Torah study, halacha, and the synagogue at Yavne. Meanwhile, emerging Christianity interpreted the destruction through a theological lens, basically viewing the physical temple as obsolete, replaced by the spiritual temple of the church. But the crucial point of no return, that arrives a bit later with the Bar Kokhba Revolt between 132 and 135 CE. When Simon Bar Kokhba led a rebellion against Rome, leading rabbinic figures, like Rabbi Akiva, actually acclaimed him as the Messiah. This put Jewish Christians in an impossible choice. Supporting the revolt meant committing idolatry by following a false Messiah, but rejecting it meant literal treason against the national liberation effort. so they largely abstained. Following the revolt's tragic failure, Christianity was legally and socially decoupled from the Jewish populace for good. Finally, Section 5. Theological boundaries and divergence, a truly nonlinear process. It's incredibly vital to realize that bounded, exclusive categories like Judaism and Christianity simply didn't exist in the first century. The boundaries between these groups were super porous for a really long time. For example, groups like the Ebionites occupied a middle ground well into the late 1st century. They observed the Torah while also believing in Jesus. The parting was actually driven by these communities actively engaging in boundary maintenance, basically defining themselves against the other. A genuinely fascinating example of this boundary maintenance is the Birkat Hamanim, or the Blessing of the Heretics. Rabbinic sources showed this was added to the daily Amidah prayer around the end of the 1st century. Its entire design was to publicly identify and expel Jewish Christians from the synagogue. And this historical reality directly mirrors texts like the Gospel of John, which vividly reflects the trauma of early followers of Jesus being expelled from their local community synagogues. On the Christian side, though, we see rigid boundaries forming just as rapidly. The Gospel of John, written around 90 to 100 CE, reflects a highly developed parting, using the Greek word iudaioi, often translated as the Jews, almost exclusively for the enemies of Jesus. And by 110 CE, leaders like Ignatius of Antioch were explicitly forbidding Christians from adopting any Jewish practices whatsoever, just to maintain a completely distinct identity. Underlying this whole sociological parting was a really profound theological fracture. Gentile Christians used Greek philosophy to develop logos theology, the idea of Jesus as the divine word, which eventually evolved into the Trinity. Well, this completely violated the strict monotheism and absolute divine unity fiercely guarded by rabbinic theology. Furthermore, the Christian assertion of a new covenant superseding the old was fundamentally incompatible with the rabbinic view of an eternal Torah. They were now reading the exact same scriptures in totally, completely incompatible ways. So, to summarize our journey today, this wasn't a clean break. The parting of the ways was a messy, painful, decades-long process of mutual differentiation. Two sibling traditions, birthed from the exact same matrix, went through a long divorce where both developed distinct identities while claiming the exact same ancient heritage of Israel. Recognizing this protracted, deeply intertwined history is absolutely essential for accurate historical reconstruction. But it also leaves us with a critical, forward-looking question to ponder. How does understanding these deeply shared roots change the dialogue between these two traditions today? When we strip away the centuries of separation and look at the shared matrix they both sprang from, it really transforms how we view their relationship in the modern world.